Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is David Novak. I'm going to read a bit from the introduction by Ibrahim Muhawi to Memory for Forgetfulness, a book written by Mahmoud Darwish. He makes some pertinent commentary on the differences of language between Arabic and English, which I think bear repeating. Reading in Arabic is not the same process as it is in English, where the movement of the attention from left to right is unhampered. Because diacritical marks, or voweling, are normally not inserted in printed Arabic texts, grammatical relationships are not immediately apparent. Meaning is deferred, and readers are forced to move back and forth within the same sentence. This, in part, explains Darwish's practice of writing long, ambiguous sentences with multiple levels of meaning. Further, because Arabic has no tense as such, grammatical time is not, as in English, defined in relation to the moment of speech, a process that interjects an implied subject in every utterance. Arabic prose does not have to maintain the consistent pattern of tense sequence required in English. Hence, it is easy for Darwish to scramble time, removing the action from the temporal sphere and placing it in a dreamlike realm. In the translation, I adopted the author's journey on the streets of Beirut in the present tense as the reference point for the action. I will continue. The book is a memoir of the siege of Beirut in 1982. It is analogous to James Joyce's Ulysses in that the author provides a sequence of one single day's events, from morning when he gets up to make his morning cup of coffee, or at least think about it. I haven't gotten so far as yet to see whether he actually succeeds or not, to the end of the day. As I say, the difference being this is memoir and not fiction. And interspersed with all that is not merely what happens, but a lot of meditations upon what is happening. I'll continue with the next paragraph. In his attempt to make the work a perfect portrait of Palestinian experience, Darwish needed a form that could free him from the constraints imposed by form itself. He therefore combined the manner of presentation and the resources of the language in such a way that readers, in reaching for the content, were plunged into the midst of a discourse that was not chronicle, journal, history, memoir, fiction, myth, or allegory, but all of them together. The prose poem can embody all of these. It allows the poet to experiment with the form of the sentence, in which the image vies with the syntax, sometimes pushing it beyond its limits. Writing of this sort makes lively reading, but is difficult to translate and can sometimes lead to obscurity, as in the following example. Then here he quotes Darwish. A building gulped by the earth, seized by the hands of the cosmic monster lying in ambush for a world that human beings create on an earth commanding no view except of a moon and a sun and an abyss, pushing humanity into a bottomless pit, in peering over whose edge we realize we didn't learn to walk, read, or use our hands, except to reach an end that we forget, only to carry on our search for something that can justify this comedy and cut the thread connecting the beginning with the end, letting us imagine we are an exception to the only truth. Then Muhawi continues. In some of Darwish's sentences, which, as we can see here, are arranged in complex rhythmic patterns that may turn back upon themselves, there is constant tension between the poetics of the image and the politics of the sentence. The image here propels the sentence toward disintegration into a syntactic arabesque of pure pattern, but is held back by the syntax itself. It is not only a question of pattern, however. When we put this sentence back in its context, where the poet is describing a large building that had been leveled by a powerful bomb, we can comprehend that the purpose of the complexity is to reach for the sublime by expressing rage through restraint. Now, on first reading that passage that Muhawi excerpted, I had no idea that it was talking about a building that had been blown up until he provided his gloss. And that describes a lot of the trouble that I am having with this book. Now, I can't say that the poetry functioned much differently, but in the case of poetry, these were shorter pieces, and with poetry, I'm accustomed to going back over the text and not having the full meaning appear to me instantly in one breath, so to speak, and for having things dawn on me by accretion. I was not prepared for that with this, and I still don't know whether I will take the time to reread this a second time, if indeed I finish this. I'm not super far in, and so far it's a bit of a tough slog. Part of the difficulty for me lies with the fact that I have so little of the history. Now, I'd like to read a section, though, that I enjoyed, and it's the thing that is making me for sure decide that I'm not going to lay this book aside as yet. So there's a footnote which comments about the youths armed to the teeth, known as the RPG rocket-propelled grenade kids. The youth armed to the teeth are Palestinian children born in the refugee camps of Lebanon. Alongside regular Palestinian and Lebanese fighters, they showed great heroism in resisting the Israeli invasion. Because the context is so alien to me, and because he is not writing for me and is not providing footnotes of his own, it is harder for me to follow. But nevertheless, here is the paragraph. But do they realize, these youths armed to the teeth, with a creative ignorance of the balance of forces and with the opening words of old songs, with hand grenades and burning beer bottles, with the desires of girls in air raid shelters and pieces of torn identities, with a clear wish to take vengeance on prudent parents, and with what they do not know of the sport of active death. Armed with a rage for release from the senility of the idea, do they realize that with their wounds and inventive recklessness, they are correcting the ink of a language that, from the siege of Acre in the Middle Ages to the present siege of Beirut, whose aim is revenge for all medieval history, has driven the whole area east of the Mediterranean toward a West that has wanted nothing more from slavery than to make enslavement easier. That's something of a tough passage, but having read earlier in this year Stephen Runciman's History of the Crusades, which includes the volume The Kingdom of Acre, now I am armed with knowledge about the siege of Acre, and so finding that reference, it made a world of difference in this passage. So let me just repeat the little parenthetical statement in which he brings up Acre. From the siege of Acre in the Middle Ages to the present siege of Beirut, whose aim is revenge for all medieval history. It's a very interesting way of looking at the 1982 siege of Beirut, and I would suppose subsequent incursions. So I don't have any conclusions as to what it means, and then that parenthetical statement comes in a broader phrase, and let me read that without the parenthetical statement. It might make it a little clearer to me. Do they realize that with their wounds and invective recklessness, they are correcting the ink of a language that has driven the whole area east of the Mediterranean toward a West that has wanted nothing more from slavery than to make enslavement easier? Reading it with the parenthetical statement inserted, it was impossible for me to make it to the end and realize that there was a question there. So, taking that out, he's asking if they realize that that the West wanted nothing more from slavery than to make enslavement easier, is also a concept which I can't come to terms with as yet. It is why I want to press on with this book, if I can, because as with Mural and the Dice Player, the two poems in here, at first I was out to sea. I didn't know what he was talking about. And as I persisted, gradually the sense of it did come upon me. And so I am hoping the same with this, but I am going to take it slow. I thought that the discussion of different languages was interesting. I brought along to show a book of my favorite anthology of poems in translation. The poem itself, edited by Stanley Burnshaw, I think. I read this when I was young, and it takes the European languages. So we've got poems from the French, German, Spanish, and Portuguese, and Italian. And it is really unique in its method. It gives you a prose translation, line by line, with interspersed commentary. And if you have the basics of pronunciation of these various languages, it's a very good way of getting into the soul of a poem. I highly recommend this book. Now, we're talking about European languages, so we have a sort of common sphere, and I'm thinking of the Walt Whitman quote, "What I assume, you shall assume." Working with languages that are closer kin, it may be possible to say that. So if you're, say, translating Spanish to Italian, or even one of those to English, or Middle English to Modern English, say, what what are the assumptions of the one tongue are probably pretty correspondent to those of the tongue it is being translated into. It is much less so the further afield you get in the language tree. So I really liked Muhawi's discussion of Arabic's lack of the fixed tense. Chinese is kind of similar in that respect. And if you have a little bit of familiarity with Chinese and you see the translations, the English is always or almost invariably always forced to interject an I or a you, and then also specific time elements that the original probably does not have or may well not have. Now, a lot of that is implied in the Chinese or understood, and so I would assume somewhat with Arabic, but I have absolutely no knowledge of Arabic, and only this year I've been starting to read a little bit of poetry in translation, and so far it has been rewarding, but it's not my wheelhouse, as we say. I will continue with this and hopefully report back that I have finished it at some point. Right now I'm using it as a relief from the history book, the Silk Roads, which I am reading, and also finding a bit of a tough travail, if you will. So I will leave this video there, just a little bit about Mahmoud Darwish in translation. Thank you much for stopping by my channel.